Half a day. This video will be about genetics and the laws of probability for freshman biology. So first off, what is probability? Probability is the likelihood that a particular event will occur based on mathematical evidence. So if we were to flip a coin, the probability that that particular coin will land on heads will be 1/2, or 50% of the time, because there are two sides of the coin. There's a head side and a tail side, so there's only two possible options, and so every time you flip it, 50% or 1/2 will end up landing on heads, and 50% will land on tails. Now this happens if we have large numbers of events, because you and I both know that there is a chance that we take the quarter or the dime or whatever the coin is and flip it, and we end up with heads multiple times in a row. So the laws of probability are based on large numbers of occurrences and the options that are there, and this is the statistical probability of something happening, not necessarily what will always happen in a real life situation. So what do these principles of probability have to do with the field of genetics? Well, genetics is based on these principles of probability. So when Mendel was doing his experimental work, he counted all of his offspring that he had with his pea plants, and he was able to use the laws of probability, the principles of probability, in order to determine what types of events were happening with the pea plants, and it all was based on these principles. So who was Gregor Mendel? Well, Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk, and he was born in 1822, and he became a priest, and he spent several years studying math and science. So he had a lot of information as well as background within the mathematical and scientific fields. He also spent some time teaching at a high school and was in charge of the monastery garden. With his work at the garden, along with the principles of science and mathematics that he knew, Mendel would work with garden peas, and he was able to collect a lot of data in working with the garden peas, and these basic experiments and observations are used as the basis for the field of genetics. In Gregor Mendel's experimental work, what he found was, when he was studying the pea plants, that they had some specific traits or characteristics that differentiated one from another. So on this table, we can see that there were some different forms of the seed. They had round and wrinkled versions. The cotyledons had, some of them were yellow, some of them were green. Flower color, white versus purple, and these other ones that you can see here. So when Gregor Mendel was experimenting, he would self-pollinate, or he would control the pollination of the pea plants, and then observed in the future generations which of the characteristics or traits were passed on, and what the statistics and the ratios were based on probability. In his garden, Gregor Mendel kept a stock of pea plants, and he referred to these as true breeding plants. And the reason he called them true breeding was, if they were allowed to self-pollinate, they would always produce plants that had identical characteristics to themselves. So, using an example, if he had tall pea plants, if they were allowed to self-pollinate, they would always have tall offspring. So these were true breeding plants because they only produced tall. You would never end up with a short plant. And so he kept this stock, and this was what he would base his research on. So Gregor Mendel would use the flowers, these are the reproductive structures on the pea plant, and he would specially control the pollination activities of his peas. So he would particularly look for a particular flower to utilize the male parts. The male parts are going to have the pollen on that, and he would cut away the male parts from another flower, and he would take the pollen from the father plant and he would place it onto the female parts, and so therefore the mother plant, and in doing that he controlled the genetics of what was the father and what was the mother. And then once those seeds were allowed to be formed, he would be able to germinate them and plant them and see what kind of characteristics came from this offspring of this particular cross. So that pretty much summarizes how the law of probability and a beginning bit of information about Gregor Mendel. And now if you would want more information, please go to the next video on genetics and the law of dominance. Thank you.